So this is the first time I'm going live. If you don't know me, I am Miss Haridas and I am a biology teacher. I've been teaching for the last 8 years in both state grammar and independent schools. And today's lesson, we're going to be looking at cells. So it's really just to help students. I know with the whole quarantine, everyone's at home. So it's just to help you build your confidence and understand a little bit of science because it's really fun. So uh, I'm going to go into my lesson. Just bear with me for a second. And here we go. Right. So if I'm talking about cells, just before we go into the GCSE spec, some interesting facts to know. So everything that's living is made up of cells. So on our planet, when I'm talking about us as animals, plants, insects, microorganisms, they're all actually made up of cells. Now, the largest cell in any human body is actually the egg cell. So, woo, go women. Whereas the smallest cell that you would find in any human body is the sperm cell. So the egg cell is about 25 times larger than the sperm cell. In your GCSE spec, quite a new thing that they brought about was to know the difference between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. So it sounds like quite a complex word. Prokaryotic cells was the most simplest types of cells. So the first cell ever to exist, which was about 3.8 billion years ago, so not 100 or 1,000 or a million, but the first ever cell to exist, science say, is about 3.8 billion years ago. And they're just simple cells, no real kind of organelles, membrane-bound organelles, sorry. Whereas eukaryotic cells, which is what we have, are really kind of more complex cells that have these barriers or walls or membranes around all of our little kind of subcellular structures. Now, most cells are really invisible to the naked eye. So we need tools like microscopes to actually be able to see cells. But there are some exceptions. So I don't know if you know, neurons, so the nerve cells, they are actually as long as from your hip to your toe. So there are some cells that are really quite long in that size. This kind of image, I'm just going to get my little laser pen, and this image that you can see here, I'll move it up a little bit for you. That's actually bacteria cells. You have about 3 to 5 pounds of bacteria cells within your body. So they make up about 3% of your body mass. So when you weigh yourself and doing all this kind of healthy eating and stuff, 3% of your body mass is actually bacteria cells. Now, they're not all bad. Some of them are actually quite good for you. A lot of them are actually quite good for you. And you kind of mutually live together in your body. So that's hopefully some interesting facts, but let's go into the actual content that you need to know for your GCSEs. So if I just get my pen out. Right, so here's a cell. This is a very basic animal cell. So what you find within you and I is a cell that looks like this. Now, there's different parts of the cell that you need to be aware of. I'll just label them out here. You've got your nucleus. I'm just going to make my pen a little bit smaller. So your nucleus, you've got your cell membrane, and you have your cytoplasm, and you have your mitochondria, and you have your ribosome. Right. So these are the basic things found in an animal cell that you should be aware of. What I'm going to do in this session is I'm going to really break it down and go into the depths of these different organelles. When I say the word organelle, I'll write that down for you. Organelle. That is any subcellular structure found in a cell. So what that means is all the little things that you find in a cell is an organelle. So all these things like mitochondria, cell membrane, ribosomes, cytoplasm, nucleus, they're all examples, apart from cytoplasm, they're all examples of organelles found in an animal cell. Now, if I go into depth, now I remember when I was in school and my teacher used to throw the words chromosome, DNA, genes, and I was so confused. I just didn't know how to connect these words together. I didn't know how they related. So if you look at the cells, so if I go back here, so what I'm zooming into this section in the cell, which is your nucleus, and that's where all your genetic information is. So in this nucleus over here, you find these kind of X-shaped chromosomes. And these chromosomes, if I unravel these chromosomes, what I will have is DNA. So your basic kind of genetic code is actually DNA that looks like this, your double helix. And sections of that DNA are your genes. So how you connect it all together is within your nucleus, which contains genetic information, you have 46 in humans chromosomes, which unravel to give you genes, which are sections of DNA. So if they ask you in an exam, what is the function or the job of the nucleus, what you would say is it contains genetic information and it controls the cell. Now, a huge misconception that a lot of students do write in exam papers that I see when I'm marking papers is some students say that the nucleus is actually the brain of the cell, and examiners very specifically do not give any marks. They give 0 marks if you say that the nucleus is the brain of the cell, because it's not the brain of the cell. A brain being an organ and an organelle, they're massively different in size. So you have to say that the nucleus contains genetic information and it controls what the cell does. Then if I zoom into this area, so I'll take my laser pen again, and what I'm looking at is this line around the cell, around this animal cell. We say that this is your cell membrane. Now your cell membrane is what allows things to go in and out of the cell. So a really good word that you must really use in exams is the word partially permeable. You can also say semi-permeable as well. And what that means is that it allows small substances to be able to go through the cell membrane, but it doesn't allow big substances, things like proteins, which are quite large, to be able to go in and out of the cell. So it's very selective. It's selectively or partially permeable. Now, the picture that you can see above, this is actually a real kind of insight. Oh, get my laser pen. This is actually a real insight into what a cell membrane looks like. So even though we just draw it as a kind of a straightforward line, it's really, really complex and actually quite beautiful. And you probably learn a lot more about it if you choose to do A-level biology. But you can see these little dots here. They might represent things like glucose or oxygen, and they can just freely go in and out of the cell. We say they diffuse in and out of the cell because the cell will need these kind of substances or molecules for processes such as respiration. So when you say the function, if an examiner says, what is the function of the cell membrane? It is a partially permeable membrane, and it allows small molecules to be able to diffuse in and out of the cell. That would give you your full marks for that. The next thing we're looking at here is the kind of the jelly-like substance. If I go back to this cell, all this middle part in here, it's actually quite liquidy because it needs to have a liquid medium for things to be able to travel in and out of that cell. So it's quite liquidy, and we say that that liquid found within the cell is called cytoplasm. And the reason why it's really important, or the function of cytoplasm, it's the site where chemical reactions take place. The chemical reactions happen in the cytoplasm of that cell. Now the more complex organelles, so we've done the main ones, we've done the nucleus, we've done the cell membrane, and we've done cytoplasm, and the more complex ones that you need to be aware of is something called the mitochondria. Now I'll write that out for you because it's quite a difficult spelling, mitochondria. And the mitochondria, I've just zoomed out of my animal cell and I've drawn a kind of an animated version of it. It's the factory almost, or the organelle that allows respiration to take place, which is a process, and it releases energy. So the reason, for example, that you have energy to watch this lesson on Instagram, or the reason that you can go from your kitchen and go socialize in your garden during this quarantine time is because you have mitochondria in all of your cells which are undergoing a reaction and allowing it to release respiration. And this picture that you can see here, the one that I have taken, it's actually from a scanning electron micrograph, and it shows you this distinct kind of squiggly structure of the mitochondria. So it's enhanced in color. Your mitochondria are not that this turquoise color, even though that looks really pretty, but you can see that the structure is very similar to what I've drawn in my animation here, and it's the powerhouse of the cell. So the main function that you must say is it releases energy for respiration. So then the final one that I'm going to go into, which is this little purple structure that I've drawn here in my animal cell, and that is your ribosome. My ribosome. So what we say, if an examiner says, what is a ribosome? You say it's a site of protein synthesis. Protein synthesis. So protein synthesis is, when I say synthesis, it means to make. If I'm saying I want you to synthesize the jumper, I'm asking you to make a jumper. So in the same way, when you say protein synthesis just means to make proteins. And this structure here that you can see is how you make proteins. So it's a ribosome, and the genetic code goes in through the two subunits, and it starts making proteins for you. And so it's very much like a factory, and that's why I've got this little animation of a factory to kind of give you an analogy of what's happening inside your cells. So that's all the organelles that you need to know about your animal cells. And now I'm going to go and talk to you about, let's use green to represent plants. So these are your plant cells. Now, your plant cells has everything that an animal cell has in terms of organelles, but it also has extra organelles, 3 extra organelles that you need to be aware of. So I'll just label them for you so you can see where the different organelles are, and then I'll go into depth on their functions. So the substance here, so jelly-like substance that we talked about earlier, is your cytoplasm, where chemical reactions happen. Then you have your nucleus over here. Let's see if I can just about fit that. So that's your nucleus, where your genetic information is contained, and it controls what the cell does. You've got this inner part, and this is a lot of students get confused as to which line represents the cell membrane. It's always going to be the inner line of a plant cell. So your cell membrane is partially permeable and allows substances or molecules to go in and out of the cell. And then you've got your mitochondria. Anyone can remember what that is? Mitochondria is where respiration happens and it releases energy. So you can't really say it makes energy, because if you link back to physics, energy is never created or destroyed. So it's not made, but it's released. So energy is released from the mitochondria. And the final part over here, this purple thing, maybe I can put it over here, is your ribosome. And that is what we just talked about a little while ago, is where proteins are actually made. So that's your kind of all the same organelles that an animal cells have. And in a different color, I am going to show you also what a plant cell has. So the plant cell has all of these things, plus it has a vacuole. So I'm doing it in a different color so you can see the extra things that it has. And the vacuole is literally it just contains a sugary substance or cell sap in there. So it's a permanent vacuole found in plant cells. You also have this thing here, chloroplast, and that's another organelle, and it contains a pigment which makes it green, a pigment called chlorophyll. And the last thing, and remember the key thing, I'll just put it right at the top, it's the outer line of the plant cell, and that's going to be your cell wall. So your cell wall is always the outer line of your plant cell. So that's all the organelles that you find in a plant cell. So if I just to go into a bit of depth in what that looks like, if we go to this kind of chloroplast, that's actually what a chloroplast looks like. And if you look at leaves, the pigment found in this organelle called chlorophyll is what makes leaves green. And it's really important, because if it didn't exist, you and I wouldn't actually exist on this planet, because it has the most important job of taking the light, the sunlight, and making its own food. So if you think about how we rely on food, I can't just go outside into my garden and sunbathe and then think, oh, I feel really full now, because I can't make my own food. the only thing that can actually make their own food are plant cells. So they contain chloroplasts, they take the sunlight and they use that sunlight to make glucose. And that glucose eventually will come through the food chain through us. So if I give an example, if I eat, for example, a cow, so a beef burger, that cow, where does that cow get its energy from? It gets it from the grass that it eats. The grass is a plant, and the plants have chloroplasts, which take the sunlight and make glucose, and that glucose is used for energy for both the cow and for myself. So that's kind of an example of the food chain of why we exist today. The other thing that a plant cell also has is it has the cell wall. So just a bit more information. So remember, it's the outer line of a plant cell, and the way that it's actually built is kind of really quite rigid. The structure of the fibers of a cell wall really give it strength and support. So the function of a cell wall is for strength and support of that plant cell, and that's to do with a substance called cellulose. So plant cell walls are made up of a substance called cellulose. And that's it. That's all you really need to know. That's all the organelles of an animal and a plant cell. So to summarize, if you just look at this picture that I have here, I'm going to get my highlighter out, and you can see that the things that the organelles that both a plant and an animal cell shares are the cell membrane. Oh, let's get a bigger pen highlighter. So a cell membrane, the cytoplasm, which is that jelly-like substance where chemical reactions happen, the nucleus, which contains genetic information, ribosomes, which is what makes protein, so protein synthesis, mitochondria, which releases energy because of the process of respiration. So animal and plant cells have all of these things, but the three extra things that plant cells also have are, let's get color green, they have chloroplasts, which is the site of photosynthesis to make its own food. They have a vacuole, which contains cell sap, and it's a permanent vacuole found in plant cells. And on the very outside, they have the cell wall, which contains cellulose for strength and support. So that covers everything that you need to know about what cells are and what they're made up of, and all the different functions of organelles found in cells. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that makes you a little bit more confident. And if you like these videos, I'll try and do them every week to support your learning. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I'll stay on Insta Live for a little bit longer in case you have any questions that you want to ask me. And this is going to be live for the next 24 hours. So if you missed it, you can obviously watch it at your own convenience. And you can ask me questions in the comments of my posts. I also have a YouTube channel, so I'm making videos so that you can access at any time. It's thestudyhive.com, and those videos are there to help you for your GCSEs and your A-levels. So feel free to watch them. If you like them, then subscribe, and then you'll get notifications as soon as I put new posts up. And that's it. So any questions? Oh, we have a question. Okay. So the question is, what are specialized cells? That's a really, really good question. If you look at the cell, let me go back to the front. So if you look at a cell, this picture that you can see here is your animal cell, a really, really generic animal cell, which has all the different organelles. But specialized cells is how a generic cell will adapt and change its features to do a specific job. So with specialized cells, if I give you an analogy of that, and I talked about this in one of my YouTube videos actually, is when you're in school and you all wear the same uniform, so you look almost identical. So when I was in school, I had a green uniform, a really ugly green skirt that I used to have to wear with a huge pleat in the middle. I apologise, Langham Grammar School, but it was really awful. But I looked the same as everybody else. And whilst I was doing my GCSEs and my A-levels, I was trying to work out what I wanted to do as a career. So I wanted to really differentiate or change or become a bit more specific. And eventually I decided that I wanted to become a teacher, and I became a teacher. And some of my friends became doctors, some of them became lawyers, some of them became police officers. And whilst they kind of went into these professions forced them to wear certain uniforms. So a doctor would have a stethoscope around their neck because that helped them do their job. A police officer might have handcuffs and a gun because that helped them protect themselves to do their job. Now, the point of this analogy is that the same thing happens with cells. They all start generically the same, and then they start changing their features, and then they start to adapt to help them do their job better, because a doctor couldn't do its job carrying handcuffs and a gun like the police officer, and vice versa. So examples, if you want me to draw some examples of specialized cells might be, let me draw, so like a red blood cell, RBC. And the reason why it's adapted to its function is it actually doesn't have a nucleus, weirdly. Most cells, or all cells almost, have a nucleus, but it doesn't have a nucleus. And that's so good because it gives it more space to carry oxygen. In the same way, if I look at this neuronal cell, if I go back to the top, I keep going up and down on this PowerPoint. Here we go. So if I go back on the top, you can see here, this is like a neuronal cell, and this cell is really important for communication. Now, how is it adapted to do its job better? Well, it's got these dendrites here to connect to other neurons. It's also got a really long axon to help it pass these electrical communications from one part of the body to another. And it's also got another thing, these little kind of fatty sheets called myelin sheets wrapped around the axon, and that speeds up these electrical impulses from one part of the body to another, because my arm and my leg don't talk to each other, so the way they communicate is through these impulses, and that adaptation makes it specialized. So back to your question, the word specialized just basically means how do you change and adapt your features to carry out your job better. So how do you change your features to carry out your function in a more effective way? And that's what specialized means. If you haven't seen that, I actually made another video on specialized cells. It's on YouTube, so I might give you a little bit more information about that. But that's what specialized cells are. Right. I think that is it. So I'll let this be on live for 24 hours, and if you enjoyed that, let me know, and I'll do more of these for you to help you during your quarantine time. Thanks for watching. Bye.